Thank you very much. I already had, I hope everything goes well. We have no technical disasters because I've already had two somewhat depressing things happen this afternoon. First, I had a very nice lunch with Professor Lerner in ancient history and discovered that he has been out to some places along the Silk Road and done readings on them where I have not been. So that's a little scary. And then I saw on Professor Ullery's desk a copy of one of my less available opuscula, minor works. And I looked at it, and he says, yes, I have it, and it even has your signature. Well, you know what that means if you're an academic. It means that someone that you signed the book to has sold it. So I picked it up and immediately discovered who it was. He does, Professor Christian Hoppeck does has an excuse. He is in his 80s. He's retired at the Institute for Advanced Study. He had to move out of his office and throw out the trash. So, you know, all of this is makes one a little bit shaky about one's immortality as a scholar. Today, I want to talk about the Silk Road, something about which I am trying to become more of an expert than I will ever become. Let's just put it that way. The World Trade Organization, is a recent innovation. But world trade goes back thousands and thousands of years. Trade, not only in objects, but an exchange of languages, of religions, of art, and not only an exchange, but even more importantly, hybridization in all of those areas. And the most famous trading network in history is the so-called Silk Road, stretching from the Mediterranean here, all the way across Asia, or as we now are being told to call it, Central Eurasia to Xi'an. There are those who claim it goes on to Japan and silk was traded on, but basically this is the area that we refer to as the Silk Road. For 2 millennia, men, women, children, and their animals have traversed this mythic route. But only in the last few decades have we been overwhelmed with exhibitions, and these are all exhibitions in the last 15 years that have to do with the Silk Road. If anyone is dying for an exhibition, this one is still at the Metropolitan Museum in New York until January. Should we have, can you see this well, the images? Are we okay? Okay, fine. And not only exhibitions, but books. These are books that have come out just in the last decade or so. The Silk Road has become hot. Now, all of these exhibitions, all of this research, all of these discoveries aim to explain the Silk Road. Where and what was it? Who lived there? What did they trade? To examine the Silk Road is to look to Central Asia, although most of us Americans know little of the history and the geography of that area. We know relatively little of its profound importance to world history. So to study this, and one of the reasons is that to study this territory requires a prodigious knowledge of difficult languages, archaeological skills, and access to places which are among the most inhospitable and dangerous on earth. And yet the peoples of Central Asia, once seen only as barbarous and illiterate nomads, clearly produced extraordinary artistic objects, and they had enormous influence over the more familiar peoples of the Mediterranean, of the Near East, of South Asia, and of East Asia. And so despite our ignorance, and I include my own ignorance there, we need to study this area if we want to understand the dynamics of the Eurasian continent. And so today I'm going to try to sketch some of those dynamics. Just an image from Google Map, again, of the Silk Road, and I want you, because we'll come back to it several times, look at that desert, which is the place that is the convergence of many of the Silk Road routes. And we're going to talk about the Tarim Basin. And here you see, here it's given the name of the Taklamakan. Taklamakan, the desert from whom no one returns. I returned, but I only went kind of around the edge. And here we see that Silk Road again. It might be easiest to describe Eurasia in a bipolar way, very schematically. It's a world of nomads on the upper steppe and settled peoples, literate peoples. There we say civilized peoples. Remember, people are civilized if they live in cities. The Latin word civitas means city. And so we have those settled, civilized peoples, not only in the Mediterranean, in the Near East, in Persia, down here, in India, and in China. Of course, it's the settled peoples who describe the others as barbarians. The Greeks foolishly called the sophisticated Persians barbarians. Why? Because the Persians didn't speak Greek. The British believed that Hindu polytheism was an indication of a barbaric people. However, that barbaric people was literate about 1,000 years before the English were. And so we always have to keep remembering that these terms, barbarous, civilized, are freighted. It is true that the steppe people did not have a written literature, but they did have other extraordinary achievements in religion and philosophy, oral literature, technology, visual arts. And we have to remember that the absence of a written literature at times, while usually the literate people will look down their noses at the illiterate, that many of the greatest works of literature, the Iliad and the Odyssey, the Indian Vedas, the Mesopotamian Gilgamesh, and even parts of the Hebrew Bible, began as oral literature. It was written down when someone learned how to transcribe them. For the nomadic peoples of the grassy plains of Asia, animals, not land, defined wealth. And animals were important to their religion, and this is a theme that we'll come back to. There were nomads with horses, nomads with camels, nomads with cattle, even nomads with reindeer further up. And of course, they always traveled along with their goats and sheep as well. And they moved seasonally for fodder and water. They fought to defend their grazing grounds. These cultures highly prized physical courage. They became the best horsemen in all of Eurasia. Their skill as cavalry spread to the settled peoples, and their chariots were introduced in the second millennium from Central Asia into China, into India with the Aryan invasions, into Persia, and even into Greece. It was one of their earliest contributions to their neighbors, and a very dangerous one, since chariots were the best military machines of the Bronze Age. These nomads were often traders who moved with their families, animals, and worldly goods in tow. And as I suggested, they did not just carry their products, precious metals, fabrics, and foodstuffs, but they brought their culture, their languages, their writing systems, their diseases, their religions, new forms of technology like the wheel and the plow and paper and gunpowder, and of course, the reason we're here, silk. Now, the Silk Road across Asia was not a road. It was a vast system of routes, stretching from Xi'an, the ancient capital of China, to the Mediterranean. In fact, Chinese silk was in Egypt in 1000 BCE, long before any Silk Road was thought about, or used, I should say. The name Silk Road was only invented about 100 to 150 years ago by a German, Ferdinand von Richthofen, who called it the Seidenstrasse, the Silk Road. That's a very portentous name. It sounds kind of like a 5,000-mile long superhighway. But of course, there was no superhighway. There were many individual paths and passes over snow-capped mountains, routes across deserts, roads from oasis to oasis that made up a trading network, even areas by sea. Individual traders rarely made the whole journey. You know, they may make your tennis shoes in China, but the fellow who made them does not bring them to Winston-Salem. There are a whole lot of intermediaries, and so there were intermediaries. And yet, there was a romance of the Silk Road, especially in the 19th century. And in a certain sense, that romance was justified, because in 1900, if you were going to travel that territory, you pretty much traveled the way people had traveled 2,000 years before, on your feet and on a burro. Throughout the 19th century, European politicians and generals and secret agents concocted something called the Great Game, an attempt to control what they called Inner Asia. You may be slightly disheartened to discover that that often focused around an area called Afghanistan. Poets like Coleridge and Matthew Arnold and Edgar Allan Poe also found inspiration there with Tamerlane, Kubla Khan. But there was still another extraordinary group of adventurers, scholar explorers with dreams of Marco Polo, who made expeditions to the middle of the continent for knowledge, for fame, and for treasure, not necessarily in that order. They were inspired by poets like Omar Khayyam and magical names like Samarkand and Bukhara. These are the places that I've not been to, but one of your teachers has. Let's just put it that way. They sometimes pillaged these scholars, but they often saved manuscripts, paintings, sculptures that they carted in donkey caravans over the Hindu Kush and the Himalayas to museums in Europe and the United States. There are lots and lots and lots of fabulous stories, and one of the fun books on this subject is called Foreign Devils on the Silk Road, about these scholars. This fellow on the left is Sir Aurel Stein. He began life as Marcus Aurelius Stein, a Hungarian Jew, who later, by hook and by crook, he managed to get the world's oldest book, the Diamond Sutra, which I'll show you later, into the British Library, and for which he was knighted. The road to fame and fortune. Aurel Stein claimed that by just reaching a dig, he could tell by the smell whether it was Tibetan or Mongolian. He died in Kabul, his tomb is in Kabul in 1942, getting ready for yet another journey. On the left is someone a little bit more familiar to most of you, at least by his impact. This is a fellow called Langdon Warner. He was an American art historian and secret agent, and is the model for Indiana Jones. He wound up as a professor at Harvard, and he managed to steal large numbers of things, which are now, especially frescoes, are now in the Boston Museum of Fine Arts. The Chinese claim he's a thief, and he stole them. He claimed that if he didn't take them, the Russians were going to destroy them. Probably both are true, the way things are in those dangerous parts of the world. Another of those, and I don't want to go through too many of them, so just one more, is a man called Sven Hagen, a Swede who, as you can see, made 11 trips over a 50-year period. And remember, these are trips in which you are walking or riding donkeys over things like the Hindu Kush and the Himalayas. He was so famous and so plugged in that everybody in Europe wanted to know him because he could put you in touch with some nice things that you could bring back for your museum. He got an honorary degree from Oxford and Cambridge. He was made a noble in Sweden. He was given an honorary knighthood rather, in England. But then he had this strange penchant for German nationalism, both in the First World War and in the Second. And then you see him with his dear friend, Adolf Hitler. And by the time the war was over, he had lost his knighthood, he had lost his honorary degrees, so you have to, there was political correctness even in the 1940s. But these were extraordinary men going out there and doing extraordinary adventures. We think of these adventures in our own American terms, you know, the Davy Crockett's, Sam Houston's, and Lewis and Clark. But this was a much, much more terrifying physical environment. Well, let's turn from scholars to the people who really matter, kings. Alexander the Great was the first European monarch to go to Central Asia. He overthrew the Persian Empire in about 330 BCE. I don't know whether you can see the red here, up to Sogdiana. He went all the way up here to what today would be Uzbekistan, Afghanistan, down Pakistan. Alexander had dreams of reaching the end of the world. However, his soldiers they were much more pedestrian. They kind of thought that they were going to get some treasure and after a decade or so maybe go home and see their families. And there was a bit of a rebellion and he had to turn back. But he opened up something. And his successors, Romans and others, began to trade across this great continent. We see the city of Palmyra still standing there, or ruins still standing there in Syria, one of the caravan sites for jumping off across Central Asia. And then the city of Petra, another site, this is in Jordan, which leads to sea routes to the east. An incredibly beautiful place to go today. Really carved out of the walls of red stone. There was an Iranian people called the Parthians here, and when the Romans fought against the Parthians and were defeated in 53 BCE, it's one of the first cases where we hear that the Parthians had silk banners with their troops, an indication that they were in touch with something much, much further east. In fact, in Palmyra, archaeologists have found Indian cotton, Kashmir comes from Kashmir. I'm sure you all knew that, but sometimes people don't. And silk from China. And so we come to that magical fiber, silk. A silkworm has been domesticated in China for near on to 5,000 years. The worm ate the mulberry leaves, it wove itself into a cocoon, and then, then we come to the nasty part. The cocoons are thrown into boiling water, the little worm dies, you unravel its thread, and you spin it into the wonderful silk. Silk used not only as decoration, but to line clothing, line heavy clothing against the cold. Bolts of silk were used by the Chinese in diplomacy. You sent an ambassador off across Asia, and you had donkeys and donkeys and donkeys with bolts of silk. And we know exactly how much silk it cost to buy certain kinds of horses, for example. Some Roman philosophers found silk immoral. Roman philosophers found lots of things immoral. It was too revealing of the female figure. But one of the things about silk is that it's not just silk per se, but that the silk carried patterns all the way across Asia. We find in Palmyra, in what today is Syria, elements in the architecture, little motifs that seem to have come to them on silk. And it's a subject I'll come back to. So we looked at the first king from the west, Alexander. Let's look at a king from the east. A king, an emperor of China, up here in Shangan, it's called, or Xi'an today, X-I-A-N today, who decided to send an ambassador, Zhang Xian, in about the year 139 BCE. The Emperor Wu, who's here, decided to send his ambassador, who's dealing here, off to the west to make alliances. Well, poor Zhang Xian was on the road for 13 years. He got captured, he was held a prisoner for 10 years, he escaped, he got captured again, etc. And from the Chinese point of view, this is the beginning of the 1,000 years of the Silk Road. From about 200 BCE, the 2nd century BCE, through the Han Dynasty down to the end of the Tang, around 8th century. And what did Zhang Xian come back with? He didn't come back with any alliances, but he came back with startling news. Startling news. Out there, way out there in the west, he found that they had extraordinary horses. Heavenly horses, they called them in China. Bigger horses than the Chinese horses. Horses that were eating alfalfa and growing bigger. And why was that so important? Excuse me. I do want my voice to last until whenever. Because the Chinese were dealing with these people of the steppe to the north of them, the Xiongnu, these people against whom they had built the Great Wall, these people who were better horsemen than they were, and they wanted these big horses. This is like an arms race. And so this becomes a very, very important issue in Chinese foreign policy. The acquisition of horses. And these horses bewitched Chinese poets, Chinese artists for centuries. In fact, 4 decades later, the Emperor Wu, the same emperor, he lasted a long time, about 100 BCE, is waiting for a shipment of horses. And we're told he wrote this poem. The heavenly horses are coming. Coming from the far west. They cross the flowing sands, for the barbarians are conquered. Heavenly horses are coming. Jupiter is in the dragon, astrological sign. Should they choose to soar aloft, who could keep pace with them? They will draw me up and carry me to the holy mountain of Kunlun. The heavenly horses have come, and the dragon will follow in their wake. Now, they are being depicted often in paintings with wings, almost like dragons. This was a bit of an obsession. Not only do the Chinese talk occasionally about, not only do they talk frequently about heavenly horses, they also mention tortoises, but a particular kind of tortoise, a tortoise that we Romanists know and love. In other words, the tortoise, the testudo, is that Roman formation that the Roman soldiers all put their shields up and they put them to the side and they go walk like this up to a wall and then burrow in. And the Chinese say in some of their sources, and contemporary Chinese scholars are a little bit obsessed by this. I had someone come to UCLA for a quarter a few years ago from the Beijing Normal University. Who are these guys out there? Are they Romans? How could they be Romans? Well, they could not. They could easily be Romans because a whole bunch of Roman soldiers were taken prisoner in 53 BCE at the defeat of Crassus by the Parthians. And these guys, this tortoise first turns up around 15 years after that. So who knows? They're passed along from one person to another across Asia. It seems a little hard to believe until we see the other things that are passed across this continent. When huge empires like China or the Parthians or the Kushans, or later we're going to see the Mongols, control much of Asia, trade is facilitated. It is not large empires that suppress trade. It's large empires that facilitate it because there are fewer little local gangsters running around stealing all your stuff. In fact, it's after the fall of the Tang Dynasty in the 9th century that trade really shuts down on this continent until the rise of the Mongols. And then we're going to see, after the fall of the Mongol supremacy, that trade also shuts down again. Here we have that Taklamakan desert, that desert right in the middle of Asia. You see this city, Kashi, or Kashgar. This is the edge of China today. China just goes up to about that point. Here you go over to, from Khotan, you go over to Pakistan. Little teeny bit of Afghanistan touches on China, but it's not crossable. And one of the things that there's much about this continent and this Central Asia that disorients you, but one of the things that disoriented me was when I was in Kashgar, I discovered that you're actually closer to Damascus and Jerusalem than you are to Beijing. China is that far across Asia. So let's look at this enormous expanse. Who is there? It's less important for us today to look at what we know, or what we know at least a little more about. India, China, Byzantium, whose settled peoples have told their own stories, whereas the people of the steppe really haven't. There were other travelers. Zhangxiang, we've talked about, and Xuanzang, very, very different. He goes out almost 1,000 years later, and why is he going out? And here's a nice little statue of him in China today. He's going out in order to find Buddhist texts. Professor Ullery would appreciate someone like this. He felt that the translation of the Buddhist texts that they had in China were not good enough. He should go and find some of the original documents. And so he walked to India. Well, I don't know whether any of our scholars today are quite up to that, but this is what he did, and he was there for about 15 years. This is one of my favorite images. It's one of my favorite images because it's very personal for me. I've been in China twice for 3 weeks each time, and the first time I was there, I went out to Xi'an, and I went with a colleague who was leading our group, who's now the chair of East Asian Studies at Princeton. And he had the director, he knew people, and he had the director of the museum give us a little talk and get introduced to us. And when I was introduced to the director of the museum in Xi'an, he said, "Oh, a Romanist. We have the only Roman in China, a fresco upstairs." So we go upstairs to look at the only fresco in China, and here you can see my picture from 1980. This is the only Roman in China. Okay. These are Korean ambassadors of one sort or another. Now, from our point of view, our being Europeans or Romanists, we look at this guy, And he looks like a kind of Middle Eastern trader in a kaftan. You know, an Arab maybe. From the Chinese point of view, of course, he has the big nose, and they call Westerners big noses, as a derogatory term. And he is someone who has come from Rome. What does Rome mean? This is Tang Dynasty. This is 800. What Rome means is Byzantium. What Rome means is the Byzantine Empire, who are calling themselves Romans. And so we have actually not a text which we can misinterpret, as we always misinterpret texts. But we have actually a document which we usually think we can kind of be a little bit clearer about. And the Chinese are describing it one way, looking from one perspective. And we are describing it something else. We see a Middle Eastern trader, they see a Roman. And I like to use this slide with students because it shows the dangers and the way in which almost everything, not only what we read, but even physical evidence has to be scrutinized. Of course, the most famous traveler from the European point of view is Marco Polo. He made several trips. He was at the court of Kublai Khan for 17 years. He claimed he did all kinds of work for the Khan. He claimed he had a passport from the Khan. We don't have Marco's passport, but we do have, this passport is in the show at the Metropolitan Museum currently. It is a Mongol passport that said, let this person through. Otherwise, bad things will happen to you. The trouble with Marco Polo, as some of you know, is that he didn't actually write down his story. He actually came back to Europe. He got involved in various wars. He got captured. He got thrown in jail. And while he was in jail with a fellow called Rustichello, who had made a certain amount of money writing up King Arthur's tales, which the King of England liked very much. And he saw a possible, something he could work on. So he wrote Marco's memoirs, translated in a number of languages, and of course we're now X number of stages away from what Marco actually said in that prison, if you can believe what soldiers say in prison after they've been back from the front. And so, we use, or scholars I should say, use various tactics to try to figure out what you can believe here. But one thing that we are pretty sure about, he said that Hangzhou was the most beautiful city in the world. And here we see his travels. 2 trips. Hangzhou out here. And also, a little bit later, in the 14th century, another extraordinary traveler, Ibn Battuta, born in Tangiers, says in the course of his travels that Hangzhou is the most beautiful city in the world. And we say, hey, these 2 guys, one writing in Arabic, one having his story written in French, this perhaps is something that we can accept. Ibn Battuta wanted to see all of Islam. That was why he went on the road. And in fact, he went, as far as we can tell, he traveled about 75,000 miles. He mentions 2,000 people that he met, 2,000 names. He claimed he met 60 rulers, including the Emperor of Byzantium. All the way down to Southeast Asia, all the way down to East Africa, all the way down to Timbuktu in West Africa. These travelers, ancient and modern, of course, put us to shame with their curiosity and their energy. Okay, enough for these individuals. Now we're going to go to those great faceless masses, some of the peoples who are out there on the Silk Road. Indo-Europeans. Some of us know a fair amount about Indo-Europeans. What we sometimes forget is they began as steppe nomads out here in what is today Ukraine, southern Russia, and they moved in all these different directions. It's easiest to talk about them as a linguistic group, because if we talk about them as a racial group, we use their other name, the Aryans, and that kind of is a little bit squeamish for us these days after Hitler did so much with Aryans. And here we see the languages of the Indo-Europeans, and you know this well. There are the Germanic languages, the Slavic languages, the Romance languages, the Greek languages, the Armenian, the Celtic languages, Persian, and Hindi, Sanskrit, Hindi, and then way out here, another little group. That group we call the Conquerors. And that is actually in that same basin, the Tarim Basin that I've been alluding to out there in the middle of the Silk Road. Another group of those, so these were the great invaders that brought languages all the way across the Eurasian continent, at least the Western Eurasian continent. And we're going to come back and find some of these Indo-Europeans in mummies that we find in improbable places far out in Eurasia. These were horse breeders. They traveled with their cattle. This group, another group, Kushans. Indo-European, in modern Afghanistan, Pakistan, and India, had enormous amounts of wealth. One site yielded 20,000 gold pieces. Their gods included Greeks and Iranians and Indians, and they became the great propagators of Buddhism. A people that was there for hundreds of years. We barely know they exist today. Here is a Kushan coin. And on one side, we have the name Basileus, the king's name with Greek. Basileus, the king. And on the other side, this Kharashti coin with the Indian god Shiva. They were out there in the middle of Asia putting together bits and pieces of different cultures. And another such people, the Sogdians. These were the great translators of the Silk Road. This is a Sogdian dancer. Between the 4th and the 8th century or so, the Sogdians, for whatever reason, seem to have been able, they're Iranian people, seem to have been able to learn Chinese, they knew Persian, Turkic languages. There were Semites out on the Silk Road, of course. Jews who went all the way to China. There was a synagogue in Xi'an. And of course, Arabs who brought their new religion, Islam, all the way out to Central Asia, to what is today Western China. And we're going to come back to the spread of Islam in a moment. And then we get to what we might call the scary step. All those people who are pretty terrifying, as they intended themselves to be. The Huns, the Mongols, the Turks. We should say that we think of, or we're told by the settled peoples, there are all those monstrous barbarians up there who came down and invaded us because they wanted our good stuff. Archaeology seems to show us that the people of the steppe were actually quite wealthy. I mentioned the Kushans having 20,000 gold coins. They made a lot of money from trading. And it is not at all unlikely that the settled peoples, the urban peoples, provoked the peoples of the steppe at times, that they attacked them in their turn. But we get one version. The Huns were one of the first of those mobile armies. There seem to have been north of China at one point, and there were Huns in India, and then finally in the Roman Empire. Here we have Attila and Pope Leo in 452, who has to go out and give an emotional appeal to the king of the Huns to turn back. and spare Rome. Scholars today believe that an enormous gold bribe was actually more important than that emotional appeal. And then the Mongols. Genghis Khan, who founded the dynasty, this charismatic warrior, forged an enormous confederacy around the beginning of the 13th century in Mongolia and across the steppe. And the important thing is that he overthrew the previous groups. So he established a very, very large empire that later they would call the Pax Mongolica. He marched south from this great wall and across Asia as far as Persia. This was a city thought to be one of the great cities of Central Asia at the time, the city of Merv. And when Genghis Khan took it from the Turkic armies, a Persian historian wrote the following, that 1 million people died. The Mongols ordered that apart from 400 artisans, the whole population, including women and children, should be killed, and no one, whether man or woman, be spared. To each soldier was allotted the execution of 300 or 400 Persians. So many had been killed by nightfall that the mountains became hillocks, the plain was soaked with blood. Now, some of this may be rhetorical overstatement, of course. But we do know that the Mongols liked to bring with them skilled workers, especially artisans. There was a show on Genghis Khan at the Metropolitan Museum about 10 years ago that showed that he had Arab workers going all the way in one direction, Persian workers and Chinese workers, and that hybridization of their skills. And I'm going to show you a few examples of that. They left behind this notion, though, of terror. Terror, but also peace. Peace that allowed there to be trade. Kublai came to power in China in 1260. He founded a dynasty. He had a Buddhist wife. And like other Mongols, he was religiously tolerant but politically savage. Produced the best silk, cloth of gold it was called. And finally, among these savage steppe people, the Turks. There were Turks in Asia from earlier, but after the Mongols we have the most famous of all of those Turks, Tamerlane. Here we have him entering a city, and here we have his tomb in Samarkand. He claimed descent from Genghis Khan. And though he spoke Persian and Turkic, he was born in Samarkand, and he was actually not a nomad by birth. He's still praised by Muslims, and especially in Central Asia, but he's especially loathed in India, where he came down, right down to the present day, where he came and destroyed the city of Delhi, Old Delhi, in order to ship the beautiful things to his home city of Samarkand. Of the destruction of Delhi, he said, and this is an eerily modern kind of statement, although I wished to spare them, I could not succeed, for it was the will of God that this calamity would befall the city. So they were wiped out. He used spies in psychological warfare. He built pyramids of skulls of those murdered in order to achieve his goal of terror. He would say, show them how terrible it would be, then they will simply give in. Christopher Marlowe in the 16th century called him the scourge of God and the terror of the world. We have, of course, successive groups of Turks, right down to the Ottomans, who came all the way to the Mediterranean and put their new capital, Istanbul, on the site of Constantinople, and it remained in 1453, and it remains there 557 years later. A Russian archaeologist uncovered Tamerlane's tomb in 1940, and the jade stone on top of it read, "When I rise, the world will tremble." you have his kind of view of things. There was the Chinese people were the settled people in East Asia, and here is the capital of Shandong or Xi'an. They still today, it was the capital of Han China, and the Chinese today refer to the ethnic Chinese as the Han people, as opposed to other people who are Chinese but not Han, like Tibetans or Uyghurs. Let me say something about the art. I only have 2 more topics: art, religion. The animal style appears on the steppe. And I think, I can't prove this, but I would like to think that it moves south and east and west, adopted by other peoples. The animal imagery is the heritage of that animal-obsessed area, the steppe. And here we have beacons. We are told, and they're from a museum in Kyoto, and we are told they were from the southern part of Russia, of USSR rather, excavated there. Gold raptors here, bulls, other animals, gazelles there. Perhaps around 2000 BCE. And if we look south from there, we have similar things in Iran around 1000 BCE. Also Iran, now called Persia, maybe 500 BCE, with animals on the edge of the armbands, drinking horns. Parthians, another 700 years later. By now we have come almost 2,000 years. To the east, to the west rather, in Mycenaean Greece, we have gold drinking cups around 1400 BCE with animals. Have these come as an influence from the steppe? Who can say? But we have them both to the west and then to the east. Shang China, 1000 BCE, a ewer for pouring out liquid with the animal face. There is technology out there on the Silk Road, and paper, of course, is one of the most invented first in China, but it becomes enormously popular. It becomes enormously popular in the Silk Road with the arrival of Islam. The need for paper to produce copies of the Quran. This is the Diamond Sutra, 848 AD, that wound up in the British Museum. Also gunpowder, bamboo. And here is a nice example of that hybridization. This is a piece of Chinese pottery made with cobalt from Persia. Something that could not be made in one place. Food went across the Silk Road. The Chinese got their onions and cucumbers and grapes and alfalfa and peas and melons coming to them across Asia. A few other examples of hybridization. Here we have Persian silk with Chinese dragons. Here we have a Central Asian carpet with dragons. I bought a silk carpet out in the bazaar in Kashgar that is trying to be Arabic, but I'm told by my colleagues who know that the Arabic writing around it is done by someone who didn't know Arabic. He was kind of making Arabic-like thing, weaving Arabic-like words into the carpet. Here we have, from the Tarim Basin, right out there in the middle of Asia, we have Greek themes. If you can see it, a centaur, a very Greek-looking portrait on a wool tapestry from the 3rd century BCE. In other words, only a century after Alexander the Great. And this is one of the record, sort of shattering mummies that was found out there close to the Tarim Basin some time ago, a couple of decades ago, with a woolen robe. This man is 6'6". He has light hair and a Western nose. Well, the Chinese were not entirely convinced about this fellow, but now they are more convinced. I'll show you in a moment. Here we have a Persian miniature with Chinese landscape elements. And some of you have been lucky enough to listen to Yo-Yo Ma and his Silk Road group, which travels around the country, and they try to put together music from different places on the Silk Road using instruments from the pipa from China and the Mongolian flute. You can buy the CDs. And here is a Turkish, Turkic, I should say, merchant. These are funeral slabs as part of a funeral monument out there in northern China. And we can tell from the details, perhaps most notably, you can see this yurt here, this kind of tent that the Turks liked. These monuments are filled with his old world. They're filled with where he came from, both the musical instruments and other things. Terracotta horses in Xi'an, once again, warfare. Something that was exported from Central Asia. And let's say something about languages. I'm sorry, I said I would have art and religion. There's languages in the middle. Briefly, these are the Turkic languages. Remember, the Turkic languages begin way out there in the center of Asia. They come all the way down to what is today Turkey. But even today, there are areas out along the northern sections of Siberia, and of course the Tarim Basin. This is a yurt that you will find out in China, near the border with Kazakhstan. This is what a well-decorated yurt looks like inside, with all their blankets ready to be thrown out when they go to sleep. And I thought you wanted to see what some Turkic children look like all the way out there at the far edge of China. They came to adore me. I'm trying to look as much like the Buddha as humanly possible. This was taken about 10 years ago. If I got in that position today, I wouldn't be able to stand up. The Iranian languages spread from the steppe in all directions as well, as you can see all the way down here in what is today Iran, but in other countries as well. And Elizabeth Barber, that great scholar of textiles, wrote a book on the mummies of Urumqi, the capital of Chinese Turkestan, the Tarim Basin, because the mummies had textiles on them. Now this is the most recent, and I saw her. She was part of a show that went from the Philadelphia Museum, and it came to Los Angeles, and she's about 2,000 years old. This is 4,000 years old. This is a natural mummy. No one mummified her. She got mummified by the hot, dry climate out there. This is the reconstruction. And even the Chinese scholars that had been skeptical about the earlier fellow had to say, she's European. That Europeans were all the way out there, probably Indo-Europeans, in the center of Asia 2,000 years ago. There are some who believe that some of these fabrics bear a relationship to Celtic fabrics much later, but I can't say anything about that. Now, about 2 weeks ago, or 3 weeks ago, the New York Times published this astounding piece of news that the Black Death's origin was traced to China. And a number of us, I had colleagues who also said, didn't we know that already? Hasn't that been in the textbooks for like a long time? Yeah, it has been. Somehow, the editors of the New York Times had not been given a good education, and some young writer slipped through. I mean, there is a little teeny bit of new stuff in the story if you read it about the evidence, but basically the headline is completely ridiculous. Sorry to say that about the New York Times, my hometown newspaper, but there it is. The spread of the Black Death started in the East, And the more evidence we have, the more it is proven. And there were earlier epidemics that had come across Asia. It's not surprising. Animals and people are moving and they are taking germs to places where there are no resistance. We know about that from the decimation of some of the native peoples in the New World. And here, the Black Death came across, and as you know, it got on the rats got on a boat in Odessa, we're told, and wound up in Sicily, and 1/3 of Europe died in the plague in 1348. And it's important to remember that things that come across, trade that comes, has good sides and it has bad sides. The great religions also spread across the steppe. And here we see Buddhism, red, then Hinduism, less important than Christianity, coming this far. And in fact, even further. And here we have Buddhism. We forget often about Buddhism. We think of Buddhism as being in East Asia. We think of it as being coming from India. It barely exists in India today. It barely exists. It exists in Southeast Asia. Hinduism has overtaken Buddhism in India, and it barely exists in Central Asia, which was once one of its great centers because of the growth of Islam. And so it is now in Tibet, in China, Japan, Southeast Asia. But we need to recognize that Buddhism was the language of Central Asia for 1,000 years. There are caves in a place called Dunhuang which are astonishing. There are 492 caves, and they are painted. If you go there, you can only get into about 15 on a given day. It was from these caves that our Indiana Jones's type people were stealing the Diamond Sutra, the Oral Stein was stealing the Diamond Sutra, and they were taking images. And there were large Buddhas. This one in Dunhuang, this one in Dazhou. I'm told now it's a little damaged from the Sichuan earthquake. And of course, one of the saddest stories, this immense Buddha, 150 feet high, that was dynamited by the Taliban in 2001. It was built in 554, and even if you're not a Buddhist, somehow the notion that after 1,400 odd years, things get destroyed is sad. And so I thought I would bring you the latest news. November 15th, 2010, according to the BBC. Afghan archaeologists said they're racing against time to salvage a major 7th century religious site unearthed along the famous Silk Road. They have warned that the 2,600-year-old Buddhist monastery will be largely destroyed once work begins on a mine. The Chinese want to develop the world's second biggest unexploited copper mine, which unfortunately lies underneath the Buddhist monastery. And archaeologists fear that the monastery, complete with domed shrines, will probably be largely destroyed. Things like the history of religion and the history of culture, of course, don't necessarily make it when it comes up, they come up against things like the history of copper mines. This is a bodhisattva. Buddhism began with the Buddha as a personal meditation. But as it went out on the road, it transformed, as all religions do when they go on the road and transform. And as Buddhism along the Silk Road became a series of monasteries, and the merchants that went to these monasteries wanted to do something for themselves. They didn't want to just meditate. They had money. And the monks said, okay, we have these holy people, men and women, who could go and be reborn, who could have reached nirvana, but because of their compassion for you, they will defer reincarnation. And people give money to the monasteries for a kind of, what exactly the word? To earn merit, to earn merit for their own reincarnation. These apsaras from the walls of Dunhuang, these kinds of angels that are supernatural women who will take care of fallen heroes. There you see the Chinese even put one of them on their coin, on their stamps. There are Chinese out across the Silk Road. That Nestorius, who was a bishop in Constantinople, who was condemned, went out across Persia to Bukhara, and we have Nestorian bishoprics all the way across Asia, even into China. And this is an extraordinary fellow, Rabban Bar Sama. He is a Turkic Mongol who has converted to Nestorianism out in Beijing and decides he wants to see where Christianity came from. And he goes all the way back in the 13th century, all the way back to Edward I of England receives him. He's actually received by the Pope in Rome. Now, here's a guy who's a heretic. If he had been in Europe, he probably would have been burned at the stake. But because he's a foreigner and they're all very interested in this and he's exotic, he's allowed to say Mass in St. Peter's Basilica. He wrote his memoirs in Baghdad. Another figure is Mani. Mani is a Persian who had various revelations, and he established this dualistic religion, taking elements of Zoroastrianism, of Christianity, of Buddhism. And this goes all the way across the Silk Road. This is a powerful religion. It's a state religion out in the desert oases. It merges with popular religion. It survives in China until the 17th century. And this is an image which I saw for the first time at the Met about a month ago. It's from a Japanese collection. It's an image of Jesus as a Manichaean prophet. And here you have his cross, if you can see it. This putting together of religions. Now, of course, we see that in elsewhere. We see it in Baha'i and in modern times. But here, as the religion moves across the Silk Road, it picks up more different elements. The most famous traveling religion, of course, is Islam, coming all the way to the west and going all the way to the east, up into the center of Asia. And you can see that they tried to replicate. Here is the Mosque of Omar in Damascus, and here is a mosque that stands today in Kashgar. If you looked at the mosque in Timbuktu, it's not very dissimilar. There are strange stories out of the Silk Road. I think one of the stranger ones is the Khazars. In the 8th century, the Khazars, who were shamanistic people, that they worship spirits, and they realized that being monotheistic was what was going to be classy. This seemed to be the way of the future. But they didn't want to become Muslims, because then they would have to bow to the Caliphate in Baghdad. They didn't want to become Christians, because then they would have to bow to the Emperor of Byzantium. And so the whole people became Jews. Now, this seems a little peculiar, one might say. And there have been a lot of controversy about this later, whether they had any influence on Ashkenazi Jewry in Russia. They were people living in what today would be the Caucasus, that area that is so unsettled in southern Russia. Oops. And so I want to tell you finally, about Zoroastrianism. Here we have Zoroaster, and you can see from the painting, we have Professor Barnes here who will give you a lecture on this painting, but we don't have time right now. From the Vatican Museum, it's Raphael's, one of Raphael's rooms, this is Raphael himself, this famous painting called The School of Athens, and Zoroaster. Who is Zoroaster? Zoroastrian There's a Zoroaster, or Zarathustra as he sometimes calls it, priest in what is today northern Afghanistan, probably. He created a new religious tradition, which has strongly influenced Christianity, Judaism, and Islam. He proclaimed the supremacy of Ahura Mazda, the great god of light. The bad guy is Ahriman, the forces of darkness. And he moved considerably from the old polytheism to something that was much closer to monotheism. His followers worshiped fire as the great purifying force, the cleansing power of Ahura Mazda. And he saw the world as a titanic struggle between the forces of light and the forces of darkness. He, of course, had influence on all of those devil worshippers that one sees later, sometimes in Christianity in the Middle Ages. He believed that one should fight on the side of the good. At death, every soul will be judged at the bridge of discrimination. The followers of the good will go to heaven, and the believers in evil will go to hell. And so some believe that Judaism, because the Jews were in Babylon and had contact with the Persians, may have taken some of their ideas from this, ideas of Satan, for example. This is the only religion, of all these religions we've talked about, they went across the Silk Road, but this one may have begun on the Silk Road. Did this indicate that these ideas of moral choice, moral responsibility arose here? You know, Karl Jaspers, about 50 or 60 years ago, the great Swiss philosopher, said that there was an axial age around 500 BCE, an age in which you had Plato and Socrates, in which you had the Buddha, in which you had Confucius, in which you had Ezekiel, all the way across Eurasia, people beginning to think about moral issues. Why? Well, no one has any answer. Why? Are they connected? Did a whole bunch of people just begin to think about those things at the same time? Or possibly Zoroaster, who some scholars date sometime between 1000 and 600 BCE, perhaps had some influence on all of this. A pebble thrown into a pond sends its ripples, an undersea earthquake sends a tsunami for thousands of miles. And so Central Asia has repeatedly affected the entire continent. So we've seen religion, languages, multicultural artistic fertility, on the other hand, military terror, genocide, and the Black Death. At the end of the Pax Mongolica, there's Zoroastrianism. We also see some monsters on a nice gold vase, and the Zoroastrian priests, the Magi. At the end of the Pax Mongolica, communications became more difficult. Traders and explorers went to the seas to try to find a way to get those wonderful things from the east. They were looking for alternatives to the Silk Road. And so, a European age of exploration, in looking for a way to the Indies, a way to go by sea, where the Silk Road once took them by land, found the New World. And so those pebbles thrown into the sea have huge effect. And I guess I would say, we all have to find our own Silk Road. It's not inside us, but it's somewhere out there. Thank you very much.